The first thing Sarah Mitchell noticed when she stepped into her brother's house was the silence. Usually, Rico, James's African grey parrot, would greet visitors with his signature, "Hello, gorgeous," or a pitch-perfect imitation of the doorbell. But today, the bird sat unnaturally still on his perch, his grey feathers ruffled and his eyes fixed on the stranger sitting in the living room. James had called Sarah over to meet his new girlfriend, Diane Carter, a woman he'd been dating for 3 months. With his wife Linda's death still fresh after 18 months, Sarah had been concerned about her brother rushing into a new relationship. But James insisted she meet Diane, saying he'd never felt this way about anyone since Linda. "Rico's usually quite chatty," James said apologetically, gesturing toward the bird. "I don't know what's gotten into him today." Diane smiled, but there was something tight about her expression. "Oh, don't worry about it. Birds can be temperamental, can't they?" The moment Diane spoke, Rico's demeanor changed dramatically. His feathers bristled, and he let out a sharp, harsh squawk that made everyone jump. Then, in a voice that was eerily similar to Linda's, he screamed, "No, please, stop!" The color drained from James's face. Sarah felt her stomach twist. She'd never heard Rico make those sounds before, and the bird had been part of their family for 15 years. That's new," James stammered, trying to laugh it off, but Rico wasn't finished. "Help! Someone help!" the bird continued, still in Linda's voice. Then he switched to a different voice, harder, masculine. "Shut up! Just shut up!" Diane stood abruptly, her hands shaking. "I should go," she said, grabbing her purse. "I just remembered I have an appointment." But Rico's outburst had triggered something in Sarah's memory. She'd heard about parrots being witnesses to crimes, about their ability to repeat conversations long after they'd heard them. As she watched Diane hurry toward the door, she noticed something else, the way the woman's hands trembled, how her confident demeanor had cracked the moment Rico started speaking. "James," Sarah said quietly, "when exactly did you say Linda had her accident?" Her brother's voice was hollow when he answered. 18 months ago. She fell down the stairs while I was at work. The investigators said she must have tripped." Rico suddenly let out another cry, this time mixing Linda's voice with the unknown male voice. "Please don't. Keep moving. The stairs." "No." Sarah felt her blood run cold as the pieces started falling into place. She looked at Diane again, really looked at her this time. The woman was frozen by the door, her face a mask of barely contained panic. And then Sarah remembered where she'd seen Diane before, in a newspaper article from 2 years ago, under a different name, connected to a string of suspicious deaths. The parrot had just opened a door to a truth that had been hidden in plain sight, and now there was no closing it. James seemed to sense it too. His hands gripped the armrests of his chair as he stared at Diane, seeing her, really seeing her for the first time. "Who are you?" he whispered. Rico's next words came out in Linda's terrified voice. "Not the stairs. Please. Mark. Don't." Diane, or whatever her real name was, yanked the door open and bolted. Sarah was already pulling out her phone to call the police, her fingers shaking as she dialed. She looked at Rico, who had grown quiet again, his black eyes reflecting the afternoon sun like polished onyx. The bird had just blown open a case that had gone cold 18 months ago, and Sarah had a feeling this was only the beginning. The sound of James's quiet weeping filled the room as Rico began to repeat Linda's final moments in a loop, each word a testament to a truth that had been waiting to be heard. A truth that had been living in the mind of an African grey parrot, waiting for the right moment to expose a killer who had almost succeeded in finding her next victim. The first thing Sarah Mitchell noticed when she stepped into her brother's house was the silence. Usually, Rico, James's African grey parrot, would greet visitors with his signature, "Hello, gorgeous," or a pitch-perfect imitation of the doorbell. But today, the bird sat unnaturally still on his perch, his grey feathers ruffled and his eyes fixed on the stranger sitting in the living room. James had called Sarah over to meet his new girlfriend, Diane Carter, a woman he'd been dating for 3 months. With his wife Linda's death still fresh after 18 months, Sarah had been concerned about her brother rushing into a new relationship. But James insisted she meet Diane, saying he'd never felt this way about anyone since Linda. "Rico's usually quite chatty," James said apologetically, gesturing toward the bird. I don't know what's gotten into him today. Diane smiled, but there was something tight about her expression. Oh, don't worry about it. Birds can be temperamental, can't they? The moment Diane spoke, Rico's demeanor changed dramatically. His feathers bristled, and he let out a sharp, harsh squawk that made everyone jump. Then, in a voice that was eerily similar to Linda's, he screamed, "No, please, stop!" The color drained from James's face. Sarah felt her stomach twist. She'd never heard Rico make those sounds before, and the bird had been part of their family for 15 years. That's new," James stammered, trying to laugh it off, but Rico wasn't finished. "Help! Someone help!" the bird continued, still in Linda's voice. Then he switched to a different voice, harder, masculine. "Shut up! Just shut up!" Diane stood abruptly, her hands shaking. "I should go," she said, grabbing her purse. "I just remembered I have an appointment." But Rico's outburst had triggered something in Sarah's memory. She'd heard about parrots being witnesses to crimes, about their ability to repeat conversations long after they'd heard them. As she watched Diane hurry toward the door, she noticed something else, the way the woman's hands trembled, how her confident demeanor had cracked the moment Rico started speaking. "James," Sarah said quietly, "when exactly did you say Linda had her accident?" Her brother's voice was hollow when he answered. 18 months ago. She fell down the stairs while I was at work. The investigators said she must have tripped." Rico suddenly let out another cry, this time mixing Linda's voice with the unknown male voice. "Please don't. Keep moving. The stairs." "No." Sarah felt her blood run cold as the pieces started falling into place. She looked at Diane again, really looked at her this time. The woman was frozen by the door, her face a mask of barely contained panic. And then Sarah remembered where she'd seen Diane before, in a newspaper article from 2 years ago, under a different name, connected to a string of suspicious deaths. The parrot had just opened a door to a truth that had been hidden in plain sight, and now there was no closing it. James seemed to sense it too. His hands gripped the armrests of his chair as he stared at Diane, seeing her, really seeing her for the first time. "Who are you?" he whispered. Rico's next words came out in Linda's terrified voice. "Not the stairs. Please. Mark. Don't." Diane, or whatever her real name was, yanked the door open and bolted. Sarah was already pulling out her phone to call the police, her fingers shaking as she dialed. She looked at Rico, who had grown quiet again, his black eyes reflecting the afternoon sun like polished onyx. The bird had just blown open a case that had gone cold 18 months ago, and Sarah had a feeling this was only the beginning. The sound of James's quiet weeping filled the room as Rico began to repeat Linda's final moments in a loop, each word a testament to a truth that had been waiting to be heard. A truth that had been living in the mind of an African grey parrot, waiting for the right moment to expose a killer who had almost succeeded in finding her next victim. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across Detective Martinez's desk as she pored over the files from the domestic violence shelter. Tommy's case file lay open before her, the photo of a bright-eyed 8-year-old staring up from the yellowed paper. His mother, Rachel Turner, had sought help after years of abuse from her husband, Mark. But before they could be placed in protective custody, they'd vanished. "Look at this," Martinez said to Sarah, who'd been helping with the investigation. She pointed to a counselor's note in Linda's handwriting. R.T. shows signs of Stockholm Syndrome, possible trauma bonding with abuser, concerns about psychological manipulation. Sarah leaned closer, her eyes widening. The date. This was written just 2 weeks before they disappeared. Martinez nodded grimly. "And here's where it gets interesting." She pulled up a photograph on her computer screen. It showed Rachel Turner before her disappearance. And Sarah gasped. Despite the different hair color and style, the resemblance to Diane Carter was unmistakable. "Rachel Turner is Diane Carter," Sarah whispered, "and Mark's wife," Martinez added. "But that's not all. We found evidence that Mark had been manipulating Rachel for years, convincing her that the only way to survive was to help him. He turned his victim into an accomplice." The revelation hit Sarah like a physical blow. Linda must have discovered the truth, that Rachel hadn't just disappeared, but had been transformed into Mark's partner in a deadly scheme. a scheme that targeted vulnerable widowers, using Rachel's manufactured charm to gain their trust before Mark stepped in to complete their sinister plan. Rico, who had been moved to the police station for safety, suddenly spoke up from his cage in the corner. "Tommy, be brave. Mommy loves you." Sarah turned to the detective. "Tommy, Rachel's son. What happened to him?" Martinez's expression darkened. "That's what we're trying to figure out." According to the shelter's records, Linda was especially concerned about Tommy. She'd made notes about suspicious injuries, about things the boy had said. Rico interrupted again, this time in Linda's voice. "I'll help you find him. I promise." The pieces were falling into place. Linda hadn't just been a random victim. She'd been getting too close to the truth. She must have discovered what happened to Tommy, must have threatened to expose Mark and Rachel's operation. "Detective," Sarah said slowly, "I think I know where we might find Tommy." She pulled out her phone, showing Martinez a social media post from 6 months ago. It was a photo of a Little League baseball team in a small town in Idaho. In the back row, partially hidden but unmistakable, was a boy who looked just like an older version of Tommy's photograph. "The coach's name is listed as Mark Turner," Sarah pointed out. "He's been hiding in plain sight, keeping Tommy close to maintain his control over Rachel." Martinez was already making calls, mobilizing law enforcement in Idaho, but as they waited for news, Rico began a new series of vocalizations, sounds they hadn't heard before, a conversation between Linda and Tommy that revealed the full horror of what had happened. "You can trust me, Tommy. She's not my mum anymore. We'll get you somewhere safe, but he'll hurt her if I leave." Sarah felt tears streaming down her face as Rico continued, the bird unknowingly providing the final pieces of evidence they needed. Linda had tried to save Tommy, had promised to help him escape, but Mark had discovered their plan, and Rachel, broken by years of abuse and manipulation, had chosen to stand by her abuser rather than save her own son. The sound of running footsteps interrupted Rico's testimony. James burst into the office, his face flushed with urgency. "They found him," he announced breathlessly. "They found Tommy. He's alive." But the look in James's eyes told them there was more to the story, something that would change everything they thought they knew about the case. The police station's conference room buzzed with tension as James shared what he'd learned. Tommy wasn't just being held by Mark, he was being protected, he said, his voice trembling. By Linda. She'd been working with a network of domestic violence survivors, moving him between safe houses for the past 18 months. Detective Martinez leaned forward. "But the timeline, Linda died 18 months ago. That's what they wanted everyone to believe," James replied, pulling out a worn envelope. "I found this hidden in Rico's cage this morning. It's Linda's handwriting." The letter revealed a truth more complex than anyone had imagined. Linda had faked her own death, using her connections at the shelter to disappear with Tommy. She knew it was the only way to keep him safe from Mark and Rachel's influence. The accident at the stairs had been staged, with help from others in the survivor network. Rico suddenly spoke in Linda's voice. "James, forgive me. Had to protect him. Love you always." Sarah watched her brother's face crumple with emotion. For 18 months, he'd grieved a wife who wasn't actually dead, who'd sacrificed their life together to save a child from a fate worse than death. "But something went wrong," Martinez said, studying the letter. "Linda's plan wasn't supposed to end with her actually dying." James nodded grimly. "Mark and Rachel must have figured it out. They tracked Linda down at one of the safe houses. That's when—" He couldn't finish the sentence. Rico filled the silence with a chilling reenactment. "Found you. No, please, not here. Tommy, run. Sound of breaking glass. Linda. Why? You ruined everything." The bird's testimony painted a horrific picture. Mark and Rachel had confronted Linda at the safe house, but this time, the fall down the stairs hadn't been staged. Linda had sacrificed herself to give Tommy time to escape through a back window. "The network moved Tommy to Idaho after that," James continued. "But they didn't count on Mark's resources, his ability to establish a new identity. He found Tommy again, set himself up as a Little League coach to keep tabs on him." Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. "But where's Rachel now? If she helped kill Linda?" That's the thing, Martinez interrupted, picking up a fresh report from the printer. We just got the DNA results from the safe house where Linda died. There were 3 blood types present: Linda's, Mark's, and Rachel's. And the pattern suggests Rachel was injured too, Sarah realized. Linda fought back. Rico suddenly launched into a rapid series of voices, a chaotic jumble of that fatal confrontation. You don't own me anymore. Tommy deserves better. Mom, please. Sound of struggle. What have you done? She's bleeding. Rachel's bleeding. The revelation hung in the air like smoke. Rachel hadn't fled out of guilt or fear of discovery. She was hurt, possibly dying, and if they could find her. A young officer burst into the room, waving a report. Detective, we found a Jane Doe admitted to a rural hospital in Montana 18 months ago. Multiple injuries, including a severe head wound. She's been in a coma ever since. Martinez was already grabbing her coat. The hospital, what's the name? St. Michael's in Missoula, the officer replied. And detective, she woke up this morning. Rico let out one final cry in Linda's voice. Rachel, you can still choose. It's not too late. Sarah looked at James, then at Martinez. They all knew what this meant. Rachel, the real Rachel, not the broken woman Mark had turned her into, might finally be ready to tell her story. And with her testimony, combined with Rico's recordings, they could put Mark away for good. But first, they had to get to Montana before Mark discovered that his hold over Rachel was about to be broken forever. The hallways of St. Michael's Hospital were eerily quiet as Detective Martinez, Sarah, and James approached Rachel's room. 2 officers stood guard outside, their faces tense. Rico, safely secured in a special carrier, remained unusually silent. They found Rachel propped up in bed, her face bearing the scars of old wounds. Her eyes, once vacant in photographs as Diane Carter, now held a clarity that sent chills down Sarah's spine. I remember everything, Rachel whispered, before anyone could speak. 18 months of fog, and now I remember it all. Martinez set up a recording device as Rachel began to talk. She described years of manipulation by Mark, how he'd broken her spirit until she became his unwilling accomplice. But Linda, kind, fierce Linda, had seen through the facade, had reached not just Tommy, but the real Rachel buried beneath layers of trauma. She promised to save us both, Rachel said, tears streaming down her face. She had a whole network ready to help us disappear. But Mark, he always knew. He always found us. Rico suddenly spoke in Linda's voice. Rachel, fight back. You're stronger than him. Rachel's eyes widened at the bird's perfect imitation. That night, Linda tried to help me remember who I was. She fought Mark, gave Tommy time to escape. I finally tried to help her. But Mark... She touched the scar on her head. I don't remember anything after that. The hospital room's monitoring equipment beeped steadily as Rachel continued her confession, providing details that matched Rico's recorded testimony perfectly. But just as she began describing where they might find evidence of Mark's other crimes, the lights went out. Emergency generators hummed to life, casting the room in a dim red glow. One of the officers burst in. Detective, someone cut the power, and the security cameras... A familiar voice cut through the darkness. You just couldn't stay asleep. Could you, Rachel? Mark stood in the doorway, his figure silhouetted against the emergency lights. But before he could move, Rico erupted in a cacophony of voices, not just Linda's and Tommy's, but every victim Mark had ever silenced. The sudden explosion of sound made him stumble backward. In that crucial moment, Rachel found her voice, her real voice, not the one Mark had programmed into her. Tommy deserved better, she said, her words cutting through Rico's testimony. I deserved better. Linda showed us that. Mark lunged forward, but Martinez was faster. The detective's tackle sent them both crashing into the hallway. Sarah pulled James and Rachel away from the fight, but Rico wasn't done. The bird launched himself from his carrier, diving at Mark just as he was reaching for something in his jacket. The gun clattered to the floor as Rico's talons raked Mark's face. Martinez kicked the weapon away, securing Mark as backup finally arrived. As he was led away in handcuffs, Rachel turned to Rico, who had returned to his perch with the dignity of a warrior. Linda knew, she said softly. She knew Rico was recording everything. She made sure he heard Tommy and me when we were safe, made sure he could prove what really happened. Even in death, she was protecting us. 6 months later, a small gathering took place in James's backyard. Rachel, fully recovered and working with domestic violence survivors herself, stood beside Tommy, now a teenager free from his father's shadow. They were there to celebrate Rico, whose testimony had helped convict Mark and expose a string of unsolved cases across multiple states. Rico, perched proudly on his stand, had one last gift to share. In Linda's voice, gentle and clear, he spoke, "Love wins. Love always wins." Tommy, Rachel, Jamesy and Sarah stood together, united by loss but stronger in their healing. And above them, watching over their newfound family, Rico kept his vigilant watch, a feathered guardian whose truth had set them all free. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the yard, but they no longer held any darkness. Instead, they stretched toward the future, a future where secrets couldn't survive the light of truth, and where even the smallest voices could bring down the mightiest walls of deception. 5 years after the events that shook their lives, the ripples of Rico's revelations continued to reshape the lives of everyone involved. The Mitchell house, once a place of hidden sorrows, had transformed into a sanctuary of healing and hope. James had converted the basement into a small recording studio, where Rico's testimonies were now used to train law enforcement officials in recognizing patterns of domestic abuse. The African Grey's uncanny ability to preserve crucial evidence had sparked a nationwide discussion about the role of animal witnesses in criminal cases. Universities began studying the phenomenon, with Rico becoming the subject of numerous research papers on avian intelligence and memory. Rachel Turner, no longer haunted by her past identity as Diane Carter, had become a powerful advocate for domestic violence survivors. Her own journey from victim to unwilling accomplice to survivor resonated deeply with those trapped in cycles of abuse. She'd established a foundation in Linda's name, creating a network of safe houses equipped with specialized security systems. Each safe house had an aviary, inspired by Rico, providing both comfort to residents and an unexpected layer of security. Tommy, now 19, had emerged from his traumatic childhood with remarkable resilience. He'd earned a scholarship to study psychology, determined to understand and help others who'd experienced similar trauma. His senior thesis focused on the psychological impact of animal companions on abuse survivors, with Rico serving as his primary case study. The bond between the teenager and the parrot had grown stronger over the years, with Rico still occasionally sharing snippets of Linda's voice, not as evidence anymore, but as precious memories of the woman who'd sacrificed everything to save them. Detective Martinez had been promoted to head of a new specialized unit, focusing on complex domestic violence cases. The Rico Protocol, as it became known in law enforcement circles, emphasized the importance of considering non-traditional evidence sources and recognizing patterns that crossed state lines. She kept a picture of Rico on her desk, a reminder that truth could come from the most unexpected sources. Sarah had channeled her experience into writing, publishing a book that detailed the case without sensationalizing it. The Parrot's testimony became required reading in criminology courses, not just for its account of the investigation, but for its sensitive exploration of domestic violence's complex psychological dynamics. The royalties went directly to Linda's foundation, funding emergency response teams specifically trained to extract victims from dangerous situations. The network of domestic violence survivors that Linda had helped build continued to grow, operating with even greater effectiveness now that they had official support and resources. They developed a sophisticated system of safe houses and emergency protocols, with Rachel's insights helping to close the security gaps that Mark had once exploited. Mark himself remained in maximum security prison, his attempts to appeal his conviction thwarted by the overwhelming evidence Rico had provided. The investigation sparked by his arrest had led to the resolution of 12 cold cases across 7 states, bringing closure to families who'd spent years wondering about their loved ones' accidents. Rico, now 20 years old and still remarkably sharp, had become something of a celebrity in the animal behavior world. Researchers were fascinated by his continued ability to switch between different voices and contexts with such precision. But to those who knew him best, he was simply family, a feathered guardian who'd brought truth to light when all other avenues had failed. The Mitchell house itself had evolved. The staircase where Linda had faced her final confrontation had been renovated, transformed into a symbol of ascent rather than tragedy. Photos lined the walls: Linda's shelter work, Tommy's graduation, Rachel's foundation opening, and countless moments of healing and growth. Among them hung a professional portrait of Rico, his grey feathers gleaming, his eyes holding the same watchful intelligence that had changed so many lives. Regular gatherings now filled the house with life and purpose. Survivor support groups met in the living room, their conversations punctuated by Rico's gentle contributions. The parrot seemed to know when to offer encouragement, sometimes in Linda's voice, sometimes in his own unique way. These moments, though bittersweet, served as powerful reminders of both loss and triumph. James had finally found peace with Linda's choices. Understanding the full scope of her work with the Survivor Network had helped him recognize that her sacrifice, though painful, had been an extension of the woman he'd loved, someone who would give everything to protect those in need. He'd begun volunteering at Rachel's foundation, offering support to other families learning to rebuild after trauma. The legal system, too, had evolved in response to the case. Several states had amended their evidence statutes to include provisions for animal recordings, officially termed non-human auditory documentation. Rico's role had challenged conventional wisdom about what constituted admissible evidence, opening new avenues for justice in cases that might otherwise have gone unsolved. Rachel's own healing journey had become a source of hope for others. She conducted workshops, helping survivors recognize and break free from traumatic bonding, using her experience to illuminate the subtle ways abusers manipulated their victims. Her sessions often included recordings of Rico's testimony, powerful reminders of how truth could survive even the most determined efforts to suppress it. The foundation had also established a scholarship in Linda's name, specifically for children who'd survived domestic violence. Tommy had been its first recipient, and now he helped select new candidates each year. The application process included an essay about transformation, inspired by Rico's role in bringing truth to light. As for Rico himself, age had done little to dim his spirit. His repertoire of voices had actually expanded, now including snippets of hope and healing, alongside the crucial evidence he'd preserved. He'd developed a particular fondness for mimicking the sound of children laughing, especially when young survivors visited the house. One evening, as the sun set on another day of healing and hope, James sat in his favorite chair, watching Rico on his perch. The parrot had been unusually quiet, seeming to sense the significance of the date, exactly 5 years since the truth had first emerged. "You know, Rico," James said softly, "Linda would be proud of all this." Rico turned his head, his eyes reflecting the warm light of dusk. Then, in a perfect blend of voices that brought tears to James's eyes, he spoke, "Love wins. Love always wins. Family forever." The words echoed through the house, touching hearts that had been broken but were now stronger in their healing. They were a reminder that even in the darkest moments, truth finds its way to light, sometimes through the most unexpected messengers. As night fell, the Mitchell house stood as a beacon of hope, its windows glowing with warmth and purpose. Inside, Rico kept his vigilant watch, a guardian of memories and truth, proof that sometimes the smallest voices could make the greatest difference. The story of the parrot who brought down a criminal enterprise had evolved into something far more profound, a testament to the enduring power of love, truth, and the unbreakable bonds of chosen family. And somewhere, somehow, Linda's spirit lived on, in Rico's perfect mimicry, in Tommy's determined stride, in Rachel's powerful advocacy, and in the countless lives touched by the truth that a grey feathered guardian had refused to let fade into silence. The house settled into its nighttime quiet, but it was a peaceful silence now, free from the weight of secrets. Rico's soft murmurs of good night in various voices, Linda's, Tommy's, James's, and his own, drifted through the rooms, a gentle reminder that love, indeed, always wins. Thank you for joining me on this journey into the world of captivating stories. I trust you found today's narrative as engaging as I did. If you enjoyed this exploration into fascinating and compelling narratives, kindly indicate your appreciation by liking this video. Are you watching on mobile? Show your appreciation with a double tap for hype. For more captivating stories and journeys into the heart of compelling storytelling, please subscribe to the channel and activate notifications so you don't miss a single upload. Your thoughts and interpretations are most welcome. Please share your perspectives on today's story in the comments below. And if you believe others would find this content engaging, please consider sharing the video with your network. Until our next journey into the world of captivating tales, I bid you farewell.